On July 3rd, 1971, the sexy, scandalous rock star of The Doors, Jim Morrison, is dead. And it's immediately apparent that the legacy he's left behind is huge.
He had created such a cult of personality around himself that people refused to accept the fact that he died anything less than a martyr for rock and roll. He came out with some radical music and some radical poetry put to music, and people absolutely worshipped this guy.
Corson is devastated. She can't afford Morrison's funeral and has to borrow money. But when Jim's will is read, Corson and Morrison's families are shocked to learn that Pamela is the sole inheritor of his estate. It's rumored to be close to $2 million. That would equal $11 million today.
You know, a lot of individuals, they look at Pamela as the primary beneficiary under Jim's will, and they would think she's going to be a millionaire. She's the sole beneficiary, he has all this money coming in, and yet at the same time, she couldn't even pay for his funeral. And what a lot of people don't realize is that when someone has a will and the estate goes through the probate court, you don't get the money overnight. It's time-consuming, it's public, and things don't move quickly.
Morrison's simple will doesn't account for the possibility of any offspring.
Well, it's very common in all estates, let alone celebrity estates, for all sorts of potential heirs to come out of the woodwork. But especially in a rock star estate, when, you know, he was very promiscuous, it would have been bright of his attorney to put a provision in the will specifically excluding any unnamed children in the will. Unfortunately, that wasn't done, so there were about 20 paternity claims on his estate.
And what about his supposed marriage to Patricia Keneally? Could she be entitled to an inheritance?
You would think that drinking each other's blood would make it a valid marriage, but in fact it doesn't. And if it had been a valid marriage, then she could have made a claim on Jim's estate. Fortunately for Pamela, it was not a valid marriage, so we never saw that claim come to light.
With the legalities of Morrison's marriage to Keneally and all the paternity suits settled, Corson faces another battle. The remaining Doors launch a claim against Jim's estate for song royalties and merchandising, worth more than $1 million a year. Corson spends the next 3 years in LA, embroiled in a legal battle with the Doors. She becomes increasingly depressed and reclusive, displaying signs of mental instability. One day, Corson drives a car through the front window of her store. With Jim's millions tied up in lawsuits, Corson lives on a modest stipend provided to her by the Doors. She can barely pay her own rent, let alone the rent due on Morrison's grave. With no shop and no money from Morrison's estate, it's reported Corson prostitutes herself to fund her growing heroin addiction, and that a former Doors chauffeur serves as her pimp. Then, on the 25th of April, 1974, Corson dies on the living room couch of the LA apartment she shares with 2 male friends. Cause of death? Heroin overdose. She is also 27. Unlike Morrison, Corson never prepared a will, so by California law, Morrison's fortune now goes directly to her parents. Columbus and Pearl Corson never approved of Jim Morrison and blame him for their daughter's death, yet they inherit his $1 million estate. Morrison's parents, who Jim himself often referred to as dead, decide to challenge his will. As the families begin to battle, Corson's parents bring forth a smoking gun.
The other interesting part of the Pamela Corson side of the estate is that after she died, her parents claimed that she and Jim Morrison had a common law marriage, and they based it on a document that was filled out for the state of Colorado. Now, they never lived in Colorado.
They never filed it?
They never filed it. They never even signed the document. It was just filled out in their names. And based on that, a judge in California respected and ruled that they had a common law marriage, which gave her and ultimately her parents a greater stake to Jim Morrison's estate.
Yeah, I found that shocking.
Morrison's parents don't sit quietly, however. They launch their own lawsuit. But just as the battle is ramping up, Pamela's parents shock everyone once again. They announce they would like to split the inheritance 50-50.
I don't think the settlement between Jim's parents and Pamela's parents was as much as putting their differences aside as let's stop the bleeding, because when litigation goes on, it gets very expensive. And so settlement is actually a very strategic decision at that point.
I agree with you, but it was really odd in this case because Jim Morrison's parents sued to try to invalidate the will and claim the whole thing. And the judge ruled that, first of all, Pamela Corson was his common-law wife, so even if they proved the will was invalid, she and her parents were still getting half. And then ultimately this settlement happened where they split it 50-50, which is really surprising. That's a big share to give to the Morrisons, who were not mentioned in the will. They didn't have this common law marriage right to hang their hat on, and they're getting half the estate.
You would think that Jim would be turning over in his grave, because ultimately his legacy is being maintained, and the people profiting from his legacy are his parents that he was estranged from, as well as his longtime girlfriend's parents who didn't even like him. So this is a very sad story of what happens when the proper planning isn't done.
The battles for his fortune finally end 4 years after Jim Morrison's shocking death. His legacy is not only immense, but also powerful in terms of its effect on a generation and the world, and it's not going to sit quietly. Jim Morrison's legacy and estate is now split 50-50 by the last people on earth he would want controlling it, his parents and the parents of his deceased lover, Pamela Corson.
Corky Corson, and people don't realize this, retained all of Jim Morrison's poetry. And wow, I mean, that was a major boon. So when you look at the 50-50 split, the Corsons ended up on the better end of that stick. He's probably rolling over in his grave right now that, you know, they put his poetry to music and then manipulated his singing to the poetry and this, that, and the other thing. And he wouldn't have liked it, but at the same time, that's a very valuable asset to the Corson family. So I think they got the better end of that stick.
The collection of Morrison's spoken word poetry is released in the album An American Prayer on the 17th of November, 1978 by The Doors. It sells 1 million copies, earning the estate an estimated $150,000. And the single, Ghost Song, climbs the charts. In 1979, Francis Ford Coppola licenses The End for use in his film Apocalypse Now.
Apocalypse Now comes out, he's featured in that, and you know, there's a whole resurgence of interest. The music that he and the Doors created in the 60s was so cutting edge, was so rebellious, it was so rock and roll. That interest was always there, and it will always be there.
More than 10 years later, collections of Morrison's poetry are published. They attract not just music fans, but also scholars, who claim Morrison is a major poet of the 20th century. In the 1990s, 7,500 printed copies of a poetry book is considered huge, but Morrison's 2 volumes total over 300,000. In 1980, the first in-depth Morrison biography, No One Here Gets Out Alive, is released. It quickly becomes an international bestseller, selling 740,000 copies, bringing in an estimated $5 million. Jim and Pamela's parents are sharing in an estimated $250,000 in royalties each year. But what really fuels Morrison's legacy is the release of The Doors' greatest hits and the best of The Doors. Not only do the albums bring in almost $22 million, but they introduce the iconic talent of Morrison to a whole new generation. Then, in 1991, reinforcing this new insurgence of interest, director Oliver Stone releases his $38 million movie, The Doors, with actor Val Kilmer playing Jim Morrison. And the band's music provides the soundtrack. The story of The Doors and their music is traveling the world via another medium. The Morrison estate receives $250,000 for the rights. In 1991, Doors albums sell at the phenomenal rate of 2.4 million per year in the US alone. Morrison's estate now earns 25% of the royalties from album sales, as well as $50,000 per year from posters and other pop memorabilia. It seems everything the ghost of Jim Morrison touches turns to platinum. And some of the remaining members of the Doors want to continue to capitalize on it. In 2002, Krieger and Manzarek start touring as the Doors of the 21st Century, with vocalist Ian Astbury of The Cult. Densmore asks Krieger and Manzarek to stop using the Doors name. They don't.
The Doors without Jim Morrison is like Jimi Hendrix without a guitar. It just isn't happening. And so they can call themselves the Doors of the 21st century and bleat away on any stage that they can get somebody to pay them to appear on. They're diluting the brand.
A battle ensues between Densmore and the Morrison estate and Krieger and Manzarek. The issue isn't around them performing. It's around the use of the name, The Doors.
The notion that they're being prevented from earning a living strikes me as a species of grave robbing. Nothing prevents them from picking up their musical instruments and singing and playing to their heart's content anywhere they want. They just can't use Morrison's name or his product. And I think that's right.
It takes 6 years for the case to finally be settled. Krieger and Manzarek are ordered to pay $3.2 million to Densmore and Morrison's estate.
Fame and the money wasn't about it. He was about the music. And that was who he was. And he was about Pamela too, right?
In the 21st century, FM rock outlets play the Doors as frequently as their most popular contemporary bands, many who cite Morrison as their biggest influence. In 2011, a Rolling Stone reader's pick places Jim Morrison 5th in their best lead singers of all time. Are only going up. By 2013, the Doors albums make a whopping $60 million. The Doors were only together 6 years, yet they're one of the best-selling bands of all time. Rolling Stone includes 3 Doors albums in their 500 greatest albums of all time. The Doors have an astounding total of 10 certified gold albums. Countless fans flock to his grave in Paris's Père Lachaise cemetery. They do drugs, write poetry, or have sex there. This creates countless problems for the cemetery. Of the more than 1.7 million visitors to the cemetery each year, over a third are there specifically for Morrison. The Eiffel Tower is the most visited attraction in Paris. Jim Morrison's grave is the second.
The Doors are one of those go-to bands that I will listen to for the rest of my life. You're asking a 58-year-old guy with a ponytail what he thinks about the Doors. What am I supposed to say? I love them. I miss Morrison, much like I miss Hendrix. It's a band whose name and brand is worth fighting for, worth cherishing in any forum, anytime.
Jim Morrison's legacy will live on, not for 10 years, not for 20 years. It'll live on forever because he was making rock and roll when rock and roll was good. They'll be listening to Jim Morrison and the Doors forever.